settle in, wherever you are tonight. Let the world outside grow quiet for a while. This is a long story, and there is no hurry in the telling of it. It comes from a time so distant that the centuries have worn its edges smooth, the way the sea wears stone. Tonight, we travel to the ancient Aegean, to an age of bronze and salt and gods who walked among the living. The story begins at the end of another story. For 10 years, the armies of Greece had camped before the high walls of Troy, a city on the western coast of what we now call Turkey. 10 years of siege, of dust and blood and bronze, of men who had left their homes as young husbands and grown old in foreign sand. The war ended, not with a final charge across an open field, but with a trick. A great wooden horse was built and left outside the city gates. The Trojans, believing it an offering to the gods, wheeled it inside their walls. That night, Greek soldiers hidden in the horse's hollow belly crept out under cover of darkness and opened the gates from within. Troy fell in fire. Its towers, which had held for a decade, burned through the night until only blackened stone remained. By morning, smoke drifted across the strait in long gray ribbons. The war that had swallowed a generation was over. The Greeks had won. Now all that remained was the journey home. Among the victors was a man named Odysseus, king of Ithaca, a small and rocky island in the western waters of Greece. He was not the strongest of the Greek captains, nor the tallest, nor the most fearsome in open combat. What set him apart was his mind. It was Odysseus who had conceived the wooden horse. He had not wanted to go to war. When the summons came, his son Telemachus had just been born, a small, warm weight in his arms. His wife Penelope stood beside him in the doorway of their stone palace, watching the ships gather in the harbor below. But the oath he had sworn years earlier left him no choice. He sailed for Troy expecting a swift campaign. No one imagined the siege would last 10 years. And no one, least of all Odysseus, imagined that the journey home would take 10 more. 20 years in all, separated from his wife, and the son who would grow from infant to man, without ever knowing his father's face. When Troy fell at last, the Greek fleet scattered across the Aegean like seeds thrown into wind. Most captains reached their shores within weeks. Some returned to warm hearths and other subscriptions. Others came home to betrayal and cold thresholds. But almost all of them came home. Odysseus did not. His fleet of 12 ships sailed westward from the smoking ruins. The sky was clear. The wind was fair. For a brief while, everything seemed simple. A straight line across familiar water. The smell of salt and pine, the rhythm of oars pulling together in steady time. Then the storms came. Not ordinary squalls of rain and wind, but something heavier, something that pressed the sea flat and then lifted it into walls of black water. The kind of weather that ancient sailors attributed not to season or current, but to the will of the gods themselves. For 9 days and 9 nights, the wind tore at their sails and drove the fleet across unknown waters. Men gripped the rigging with bleeding hands. Provisions washed overboard into foam. The stars, by which every sailor steered, vanished behind clouds so thick it seemed the sky itself had been sealed shut. On the 10th day, the winds fell silent. The sea lay flat and gray beneath a pale, uncertain sun. The ships drifted in water that no Greek had ever charted. Behind them, the familiar coastlines had disappeared. Ahead, there was only open ocean, and the faint, dark shapes of islands no one could name. Odysseus stood at the prow of his ship and looked out at the unknown world. His men were hungry, battered, and spent. Their drinking water was nearly gone. Somewhere far to the west, his island waited, Ithaca, with its olive groves and its rocky harbor and its single thin column of hearth smoke rising above the palace roof. He did not know it yet, But the gods had drawn a longer road for him. The sea would not give him back easily. There would be monsters and enchantments ahead, songs that promised sweet oblivion, islands where time moved strangely, and choices that no man should ever have to make. But all of that lay ahead, hidden beyond the curve of the water. For now there was only the creak of wet timber, the slow drip of brine from the rigging, and the quiet breathing of tired men who still believed they would see their homes before the next moon rose. And far away on the stony shore of Ithaca, a young boy, though by now he was hardly a boy any longer, stood watching the empty horizon where the sea met the sky. He had been waiting since before he could remember. His name was Telemachus, and his father was already years overdue. This is the story the ancient Greeks called the Odyssey, a word that has since come to mean any long and difficult journey. It was composed nearly 2,800 years ago, in a language that sang when spoken aloud. Tonight, we follow it slowly, scene by scene, across a sea that remembers everything. Chapter 2, A House Without Its King. While Odysseus drifted somewhere beyond the edge of the known world, life on Ithaca went on, but it went on wrong. The palace still stood on its hill above the harbor. Smoke still rose from its kitchen fires. But the rooms that had once held order and quiet authority now echoed with voices that did not belong there. They came from the nearby islands, and from the noble families of Ithaca itself. Young men, ambitious men, more than 100 of them. They called themselves suitors. Their purpose, they announced, was to court the queen. If Odysseus was dead, then Penelope was free to remarry, and whoever married the queen would become the next king. 108 men settled into the palace and refused to leave. They slaughtered the king's cattle for their feasts. They drank his wine from morning until the lamps burned low. They lounged in his hall, threw bones to his dogs, and competed noisily for his wife's attention, while servants carried out platter after platter of food that was not theirs. The great hall, which had once been a place of measured hospitality, where guests were welcomed with a basin of water for their hands and a careful cup of watered wine, had become something closer to a tavern. Grease stained the carved wooden benches. The stone floor was littered with bones and the dark rings of spilled drink. Penelope watched all of this from her quarters above the hall. She was not a woman given to panic or display. She had managed the household alone for nearly 20 years, overseeing harvests, settling disputes among tenants, raising her son in the long shadow of an absent father. She had learned how to endure. But she also knew she could not refuse the suitors forever without a plan, so she devised one. She told them she would choose a new husband, but only after she finished weaving a burial shroud for Laertes, Odysseus's aging father. It was a sacred duty, she said quietly. No one could argue with it. Each day, Penelope sat at her great loom in the upper chamber, working the threads with practiced hands. The shuttle moved back and forth, the cloth grew slowly wider, and the suitors waited below, drinking and gambling among themselves, satisfied that progress was being made. They did not know what she did after dark. When the hall grew quiet and the last lamp guttered in its bracket, Penelope returned to the loom alone. She pulled the threads loose, carefully, row by row, undoing the entire day's work by the light of a single flame. By morning, the shroud was no larger than it had been the day before. She kept this secret for 3 full years. It was a deception worthy of Odysseus himself, patient, quiet, hidden in plain sight. But in the end, one of her own handmaidens betrayed her to the suitors. They discovered what she had been doing. They were furious. Now they pressed harder than ever, demanding she choose. The shroud was nearly finished. There were no more delays to invent. Through all of this, Telemachus grew up in the margins of his own home. As a child, he had waited at the harbor each evening, watching for a familiar sail. As a teenager, he sat in the great hall and listened to the suitors mock his absent father. He clenched his fists beneath the table, but said nothing. By the time he turned 20, Telemachus was tall and strong across the shoulders, but he carried himself like someone who had never been sure of his own place. He had no memory of Odysseus. He had only stories, tales of cleverness and courage told by aging servants who still remembered the young king before the war. He wanted to act, but he did not know what action to take. He wanted to throw the suitors from his house, but they outnumbered him more than 100 to 1. He wanted to believe his father lived, but every passing year made that belief harder to hold. He felt trapped inside his own inheritance. Then, on an ordinary afternoon, a stranger arrived at the palace gate. He was tall and carried himself with a kind of quiet certainty. He gave his name as Ments, a merchant and old friend of the family. But he was not Ments. Beneath the mortal disguise moved the goddess Athena, gray-eyed guardian of craft and war. Athena had always favored Odysseus. His sharp intelligence, his preference for strategy over brute force, that favor now extended to his son. She sat with Telemachus in a corner of the noisy hall, away from the suitors' laughter, and spoke to him without softening her words. "Your father is alive," she said. "He will not come to you. You must go and seek word of him yourself." It was the first time anyone had spoken to Telemachus, not as a boy to be protected, but as a man with something to do. Something shifted behind his eyes. He looked across the hall at the suitors with a clarity he had not felt before. Not anger, exactly, but a quiet recognition that the shape of things could change. Upstairs, Penelope sat beside her loom in the half-dark. She had heard the restless movement below, her son's footsteps pacing, the low creak of the courtyard gate. She did not call out to him. She understood, perhaps better than anyone in that house, that some journeys have to begin in silence. She held a loose thread between her fingers and waited. That night, Telemachus lay awake in his small room above the courtyard, listening to the sea. The same sea his father had sailed across 20 years before. He did not yet know where he would go, or whom he would find waiting at the end of the road. But for the first time in his life, he had decided to stop waiting. Before dawn, he rose and walked to the harbor. The air was cool and still. Fishing boats rocked gently at their moorings, their hulls dark against the paling water. He would need a ship, a crew of 20 men, and the courage to leave the only place he had ever known. Somewhere beyond that dark horizon, there might still be an answer. Chapter 3. The Sun's Journey. Telemachus sailed before the sun had fully risen. His ship was small and dark-hulled, crewed by 20 young men from the island. Fishermen and farmers' sons who had never ventured far from Ithaca's rocky shores. Athena, still wrapped in her mortal disguise, stood beside him at the stern as the harbor shrank behind them and the open water spread wide ahead. Their first destination was Pylos, a coastal kingdom on the mainland to the east. Its ruler was Nestor, the oldest of the Greek captains who had fought at Troy. He was as a man of long memory and careful speech, the kind of elder who remembered every name, every oath, every ship that had sailed from every harbor. When Telemachus arrived, Nestor was conducting a sacrifice on the beach. 9 rows of men seated on the sand, the smoke of roasting meat drifting upward in the morning air. The old king welcomed the young stranger warmly, offering him a golden cup of wine before asking his name or his purpose. Telemachus introduced himself, and Nestor's weathered face softened at the sound of the name. He had known Odysseus well. They had fought side by side for 10 long years. He spoke of the war, of the long nights inside the wooden horse, of Odysseus's steady nerve when other men trembled. But of the journey home, Nestor knew very little. He told Telemachus that the Greek fleet had scattered after the fall of Troy. Some captains had quarreled bitterly over which route to take. Others had offended the gods and paid for it with storms and broken ships. Nestor himself had sailed home swiftly, and so he had no news of those who had taken longer paths across the water. But he offered a suggestion. If anyone knew what had happened to Odysseus, it would be Menelaus, king of Sparta, husband of Helen, the woman whose abduction had set the entire war in motion. Menelaus had wandered for years after Troy, before finally reaching home. He had seen things no other Greek had seen. Nestor lent the young man a chariot and horses for the overland journey. The road from Pylos to Sparta crossed wide plains of golden wheat and wound through mountain passes where the air grew thin and cold. It was the farthest Telemachus had ever traveled from his own shore. Each mile felt like a quiet act of becoming. Sparta's palace gleamed in the afternoon light, a hall of polished stone and bronze, richer than anything Telemachus had ever seen. Menelaus received him with open arms. At the king's side sat Helen herself, older now. Her beauty settled into something quieter, but no less arresting. She poured wine from a silver bowl and studied the young visitor's face. "You look like him," Helen said softly. "The same eyes." Something tightened in Telemachus's chest. A longing for a man he had never truly known, sharpened suddenly by the recognition in a stranger's gaze. Menelaus nodded slowly from across the table. He had noticed it too. The resemblance was unmistakable. Over a long evening meal, Menelaus told his own story. After leaving Troy, he had been blown wildly off course. To Egypt and beyond. For 8 difficult years he wandered the southern seas, unable to find his way home. It was during those lost years that he encountered a strange being called Proteus, the old man of the sea, a shape-shifting god who knew all things. Menelaus had wrestled Proteus on a beach at dawn, holding him fast as the god shifted from lion to serpent, to rushing water to a column of roaring flame. When at last the old man yielded, he revealed the fates of every Greek captain who had sailed from Troy. And among those fates, he spoke of Odysseus. "He is alive," Menelaus told Telemachus quietly, "but he is far from home." Proteus said, "Your father was held captive on a distant island, trapped by a goddess who would not let him leave. He sits by the sea each day and stares at the horizon, longing for a shore he cannot reach." Telemachus sat very still. For years he had feared the worst, that his father's bones rested at the bottom of some forgotten stretch of ocean. Now, for the first time, he held something more solid than hope. Odysseus lived. He was a prisoner, but he was breathing. The knowledge settled into the young man like an anchor, finding the seabed. He wanted to sail at once, to find the island, and bring his father home by force if necessary. But Athena appeared to him again, this time in a dream, standing at the foot of his bed in Menelaus's guest chamber. She spoke with quiet urgency. "Go home to Ithaca," she told him. "Your father's return is closer than you think. But the suitors have laid a trap." Back on Ithaca, the suitors had learned of Telemachus's departure and grown uneasy. The passive boy they had dismissed for years was now traveling the Greek world, asking questions, seeking allies. If he returned with powerful friends, their hold on the palace could weaken. They armed a fast ship and hid it in the narrow strait, waiting to ambush him on his way home. But Athena had already foreseen this. She guided Telemachus along a different route, through deeper waters, around the far side of the island, past headlands the suitors were not watching. His ship slipped through in the dark, unseen. He stepped ashore on Ithaca, just before dawn, older in ways that had nothing to do with the calendar. He had left as a young man uncertain of his own name's weight. He returned knowing that his father was not merely a story told by aging servants, but a living man held somewhere beyond the sea, still trying to come home. Telemachus walked up the stony path from the harbor, and for the first time, the island felt like something worth defending. Chapter 4. The Lotus in the Cave. Now the story turns. We leave Ithaca and its troubled palace, and we step backward through the years to the days just after the fall of Troy. What follows is not told by an outside voice. In the Odyssey itself, it is Odysseus who tells this part of the story, seated at a fire-lit feast in a distant kingdom, speaking quietly into the attention of a room full of strangers. He began at the beginning, the first landfall after Troy. His 12 ships sailed northwest along the Thracian coast and came to the city of Ismarus, home of the Cyclops, allies of the fallen Trojans. The Greeks attacked at dawn, stormed the settlement, and plundered its stores of wine and grain. It was a raid born of 10 years' hunger and soldiering habit. Odysseus ordered his men back to the ships before the inland Cyclops could rally their forces. But the men would not listen. They had found strong wine, fresh meat, and the warmth of beach fires after weeks at sea. They wanted one more night. By dawn, the Cyclops had gathered reinforcements, mounted spearmen riding down from the hills in tight, disciplined lines. The counterattack was swift and punishing. 6 men from every ship were killed before the rest could scramble back to the water. They rowed out in disorder, oars splashing unevenly, shields still wet with blood, the cries of the fallen carrying faintly across the surf. It was the first wound of the journey, and it had been entirely of their own making. Then came the great storm, the one that lasted 9 days and 9 nights, that tore the sails to ribbons and drove the fleet far from any familiar landmark. When it finally exhausted itself, the ships drifted toward a low green shore where strange flowers grew thick along the sand. This was the land of the lotus eaters. The people on this shore were gentle. They carried no weapons and showed no fear of the strangers. They simply smiled and offered the newcomers a taste of their food, a soft, sweet fruit that grew from the lotus plant. It smelled faintly of honey and ripe figs, and every man who tasted it felt an immediate and overwhelming calm. But it was not calm. It was forgetting. The lotus erased all memory of home, the faces of wives, the sound of children laughing in a courtyard, the name of the island where they had been born. The men who ate the fruit sat down on the warm sand with blank, contented eyes and refused to move. They no longer wished to go anywhere at all. Odysseus had not eaten the fruit. He saw what was happening and moved quickly. He dragged his weeping men back to the ships by force, binding the worst of them beneath the rowing benches so they could not leap overboard and swim back to shore. He ordered the remaining fleet to sail immediately, before anyone else could be drawn in by the sweetness. The men who had tasted the lotus wept as the shore disappeared behind them, not from any pain, but from longing for a place they had known for less than a single hour. Odysseus stood at the helm and gave the order to row faster. No one spoke. No one looked back. The green shore faded into haze and was gone. The fleet sailed on through calm water, past rocky headlands and scattered islands, until they came to a place where wild goats grazed along a wooded shore. Across a narrow channel lay another island, larger, with steep gray cliffs and thin columns of smoke rising from somewhere deep inland. Someone, or something, was living there. Odysseus chose 12 of his best men and loaded a goatskin of dark, potent wine, a gift he had taken from a priest of Apollo at Ismarus, so strong it needed to be mixed with 20 parts of water before a man could drink it safely. He rowed across the channel with this small party, leaving the rest of the fleet anchored in the shelter of the Goat Island. They followed the smoke to the mouth of an enormous cave. Inside, they found pens of young lambs and kids, and rough shelves stacked with rounds of fresh cheese. Pails of whey stood in neat rows along the damp walls. The cave was vast, more like a cathedral hollowed from the rock than any ordinary dwelling. But its owner was nowhere to be seen. The men wanted to take the cheese and leave. Odysseus, curious as always, insisted on waiting. He wanted to meet the cave's inhabitant and offer wine in exchange for supplies, the sacred custom of guest friendship that bound every civilized being in the Greek world. It was a decision he would come to regret for the rest of his life. At dusk, the ground began to shake with heavy, rhythmic footsteps. A shadow darkened the cave mouth. The owner had returned, and he was not a man. He was a Cyclops, a one-eyed giant called Polyphemus, son of the sea god Poseidon and the sea nymph Ithaca. His single enormous eye, set deep in the center of his forehead, caught the firelight like a dull coin of bronze. Without so much as a glance at the strangers, Polyphemus drove his flock of massive sheep into the cave, then sealed the entrance behind him with a slab of stone so heavy that 20 men working together could not have moved it an inch. Only then did he turn and notice the small figures pressed against the far wall of his home. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice low and enormous. Odysseus stepped forward and spoke with care. "They were soldiers," he said, blown off course on their way home from the war at Troy. He offered wine in exchange for shelter and invoked the name of Zeus, protector of guests and travelers. Polyphemus only laughed. He said he cared nothing for Zeus or his laws. Then the giant reached down and seized 2 of the men, one in each hand. He dashed them against the stone floor and devoured them, armor and all, the sound of it filling the cave while the others flattened themselves against the rock, too horrified even to cry out. When he had finished, the Cyclops lay down among his sheep and fell into a deep, heavy sleep. The surviving men looked to Odysseus in the trembling dark. Some wept without making a sound. Others gripped their swords, ready to drive a blade into the sleeping monster. But Odysseus held up his hand. If they killed the giant now, who would move the stone? They would be sealed inside this cave forever, with no way out. He told them to wait. He told them he had the beginning of a plan. Chapter 5. Nobody. Morning came slowly inside the sealed cave. No light entered except a thin seam along the edge of the great stone slab, where the rock did not sit perfectly flush against the wall. The giant woke, reached casually for 2 more men, and ate them as he had eaten the others, without ceremony, without hesitation, as if they were nothing more than bread. Then Polyphemus rolled the stone aside just enough to let his sheep file out to graze. He sat in the opening, with his thick arms spread wide, running his hands over the back of each animal as it passed, feeling for anyone who might try to slip out among the flock. When the last sheep was through, he sealed the cave again and followed them into the daylight. Odysseus moved quickly. In the back of the cave lay a massive length of green olive wood, the Cyclops' walking staff, as thick and tall as the mast of a sailing ship. He ordered his remaining men to cut a length from it and sharpen one end to a fine, hardened point. They heated the tip in the embers of the dying fire until it glowed. Then they hid the stake beneath a pile of dung and waited. The full shape of the plan lived only in Odysseus's mind. He sat against the damp stone wall with the goatskin of unmixed wine resting across his knees, turning each step over carefully, the way a man threads a needle by the last of the evening light. At dusk, Polyphemus returned with his flock. He sealed the cave, milked his ewes, and reached for 2 more men. 6 gone now in 2 days. 8 remained, plus Odysseus. time was bleeding away. When the giant had finished his meal and settled against the wall, Odysseus rose and stepped forward, holding up the goatskin of dark wine with both hands. "Here, Cyclops, try this," he said, keeping his voice level and even. "It is the finest wine from our ship. I brought it as a gift for you." The giant snatched the goatskin and drank deeply. His single eye widened. He had never tasted anything so strong, dark, undiluted, burning with a sweetness that flooded his throat like warm honey. "More," the giant demanded. Odysseus poured again and again. The wine, meant to be diluted 20 parts water to 1, went down in long, greedy swallows. Polyphemus's enormous head began to droop. His hands loosened at his sides. His voice thickened into a slur. He asked Odysseus, almost pleasantly now, what his name was, so he might offer a guest gift in return. Odysseus answered without hesitation. "My name is Nobody," he said. "That is what my mother and father call me, and that is what all my companions call me too. Nobody." The giant grunted, amused by the strange sound of it. Then he offered his gift. He would eat nobody last, he said. His eye slid shut, and he toppled sideways into a deep, wine-soaked sleep. The men did not need to be told twice. They dragged the sharpened stake from its hiding place and held its point in the fire until the green olive wood glowed orange at the tip. Then, gripping it together, 4 of them lifted the stake and drove it straight into the giant's single sleeping eye. They leaned their weight into it and twisted. Polyphemus screamed, a sound so vast it shook loose stones from the ceiling and sent the penned sheep scrambling in terror. He clawed at his ruined eye, flailing his enormous arms through the darkness, crashing blindly against the walls of his own cave. The men pressed themselves into the farthest corners, flattening their bodies against the cold stone while the giant raged. His screams drew the other Cyclops from their caves across the island. They gathered outside the sealed entrance and called through the rock. "What is wrong, Polyphemus? Who is hurting you?" And through his agony, the blinded giant roared back the only name he had been given. "Nobody. Nobody is killing me." The others paused, confused. If nobody was hurting him, there was nothing they could do. They turned and walked away. It was the trick on which everything turned, a single false name, planted patiently hours earlier, bearing its fruit now in the shaking dark. Polyphemus could not see, he could not summon help. He dragged himself to the cave mouth, shoved the stone aside, and sat in the opening with his arms spread wide, determined to catch anyone who tried to crawl past. But Odysseus had already foreseen this. He ordered his men to lash themselves beneath the bellies of the largest rams. 3 sheep abreast for each man, with the man bound tightly under the middle one, hidden deep within the thick, unwashed wool. When dawn came and the flock stirred toward the entrance, Polyphemus ran his fingers along each animal's back, feeling for riders. He found nothing. His hands passed over wool and spine, over the warm flanks of his own sheep, and he let them go one by one, through the opening into pale morning light. Beneath them, pressed tight against the animals' bellies, the men held their breath. They inched past the giant's reaching hands, through the narrow gap, and out into the open air of a world they had not expected to see again. They ran. Down the rocky slope, across the shore, into the shallows where the ship waited. They cut the rams loose, threw themselves aboard, and pulled at the oars before the last man had even cleared the rail. The ship lurched forward. Behind them, the cave mouth gaped open and empty in the gray morning light, and the sound of the giant's sobbing carried faintly across the water. They should have sailed in silence. Any wise man would have let the island shrink into the distance without a word. But as the headland fell away behind them, something rose in Odysseus that he could not hold down. The cleverness that had saved them all now twisted into pride, the old, dangerous kind that needs to be recognized. He stood at the stern and shouted back across the widening water. "Cyclops, you fool! If anyone ever asks who blinded you, who took your eye and brought you to your knees in your own cave, you tell them it was Odysseus, son of Laertes, king of Ithaca." His voice rang clear and hard across the strait. He wanted the giant to know his name. It was the worst mistake of his life. Polyphemus heard every word. Blind and bleeding, he staggered to the cliff's edge and hurled a boulder toward the sound. It struck the water just short of the ship, sending a wave that nearly drove them back to shore. Then the giant raised his arms to the empty sky and called out to his father. Not to Zeus, not to any Olympian, but to Poseidon, lord of the dark and restless deep. "Hear me, father," he cried. "If I am truly your son, then let Odysseus of Ithaca never reach his home, or if the fates have already written his return, let him arrive late and broken, with every companion lost, and let him find nothing but sorrow waiting at his own door." Far beneath the waves, in the cold and lightless halls of the ocean floor, the god of the sea heard his son's prayer. And from that hour forward, the water itself turned against Odysseus. Every wave, every current, every storm cloud gathering on the horizon carried a new and personal weight. The way home, which had been long already, had just become immeasurably longer. Chapter 6. Winds, Giants, and the Enchantress. The fleet sailed on through waters no Greek chart had ever marked, the invisible weight of Poseidon's curse trailing behind them like a current just beneath the surface. The men at the oars did not know what had been set in motion. The sea looked the same as it always had. Wide, gray, indifferent. But Odysseus, standing at the stern, said nothing. He had heard the prayer. After several days, they reached a strange island ringed by cliffs of polished bronze that caught the sun and threw it back in blinding sheets. This was the floating island of Aeolia, home of Aeolus, the keeper of the winds, a figure appointed by the gods themselves to hold power over every gust and gale that crossed the open water. Aeolus welcomed Odysseus into his palace and listened for an entire month to the stories of Troy and the wanderings that had followed. He was fascinated by Odysseus's intelligence, by the quiet weight of sorrow behind his words. When it came time for the Greeks to leave, the Windkeeper offered a remarkable gift. He took a great leather bag, stitched shut with a cord of gleaming silver, and trapped inside it every wind that blew across the sea, every breeze, every storm, every shifting current of air, save one. He left free only the steady west wind, the one that would carry the ships directly home. All they had to do was keep the bag sealed. Odysseus thanked Aeolus and stowed the bag aboard his own ship. Then he gave the order to sail. For 9 days and 9 nights, the fleet moved westward under perfect skies. The sea was glass, the wind was faithful. Odysseus sat at the helm with the leather bag clamped in his arms, refusing to sleep, refusing to eat, refusing to let another man so much as touch it. On the 10th morning, the coast of Ithaca appeared. The rocky headlands, the harbor, the thread of pale smoke rising from the palace. They were close enough to see the shapes of individual olive trees on the hillside. A few more hours, and 20 years of absence would end. And then, at last, Odysseus closed his eyes. It was only for a moment, or so he intended. But his body, denied rest for 9 straight nights, surrendered completely. He slumped against the gunwale, the bag still resting in the crook of his arm, and fell into a sleep so deep that nothing could have woken him. Not even the sound of his own crew whispering beside him. They had been watching that bag for 9 days. They were convinced it held gold, a private treasure from Aeolus that Odysseus meant to keep for himself. Now, with Ithaca in sight and their captain finally unconscious, the temptation became too great. They loosened the silver cord. The bag fell open, and every imprisoned wind burst free at once. The sea erupted. A roaring gale struck the fleet from every direction, tearing sails from masts, spinning the ships like driftwood in a flooded river. Odysseus woke to chaos, to the sound of snapping timber, to the sight of the empty bag flapping in the wind like a shed skin. He looked toward the horizon. Ithaca was already gone, shrinking to a thin gray line, then to nothing at all. He stood at the rail and watched his homeland vanish for the second time. The storm drove them far across the sea to the land of the Laestrygonians, a race of towering giants even more savage than the Cyclops. The fleet entered a narrow harbor ringed by sheer cliffs, a fjord so deep and enclosed it felt like sailing into a stone throat. 11 of the 12 ships anchored inside the harbor. Only Odysseus, wary by instinct, kept his vessel near the open mouth. It saved his life. The giants appeared on the cliffs above, enormous figures silhouetted against the sky, and began hurling boulders down into the trapped harbor. The rocks crashed through hulls and decks, splintering timber, crushing men where they stood. Sailors who leapt into the water were speared from above. Within minutes, the harbor ran dark with wreckage. Odysseus cut his anchor line and screamed at his crew to row. They pulled with everything left in their arms, oars bending against the water, the sounds of destruction echoing off the cliff walls behind them. 11 ships and all the men who had sailed them. Friends, brothers in arms, men who had survived 10 years of war, were gone. Destroyed in less time than it takes to tell it. One ship remained. One crew. Fewer than 50 men, silent and hollow-eyed, rowing through water still thick with floating debris. They had left Troy with a fleet. Now they were alone on an ocean that seemed to grow wider with every stroke of the oars. No one spoke. The only sound was the creak of wood and the slow drip of water from the blades. Days passed before currents carried them to a thickly wooded island where tall oaks grew down to the water's edge. The air smelled of wild thyme and distant smoke. Somewhere deep among the trees stood a house of polished stone, surrounded by wolves and mountain lions that paced in the dappled shade, strangely calm, watching the newcomers with something unsettlingly close to human recognition. This was Aphaea, and the house belonged to Circe, daughter of Helios, the sun god. She was beautiful and ancient, her voice drifting through the trees like a half-remembered melody. When Odysseus sent a scouting party ahead, she welcomed them inside with warm bread, honeyed wine, and a thick, fragrant stew that steamed in copper bowls. The men ate gratefully, but within moments their bodies began to change. Hands thickened into trotters, faces stretched into snouts, coarse bristles pushed through their skin. One by one, Circe's guests became pigs, squealing, stumbling on unfamiliar legs, their human eyes wide with a terror they could no longer speak. She drove them calmly into a pen and latched the gate. Only Eurylochus escaped, the one man who had refused to enter the house. He ran back to the ship, shaking, barely able to form words. Odysseus listened, strapped on his sword, and set off alone through the forest. On the path, the god Hermes appeared, a young man with winged sandals and a calm, knowing smile, and pressed a small plant into his palm. It was called moly, a flower with white petals and a root as black as ink. "Eat this before you enter," Hermes said, "and her magic will pass through you like water through stone. When she strikes you with her wand and nothing happens, draw your sword and hold it to her throat. She will yield." Then Hermes was gone, dissolved into the shifting light between the trees. Odysseus entered the stone house and ate what Circe placed before him. She raised her wand and struck. Nothing happened. His body remained his own. Before she could step back, his sword was at her neck. For the first time in centuries, someone had broken through her power. Her expression shifted, from disbelief to curiosity to something that looked very much like respect. She restored every man to human form. She invited the crew to stay as honored guests, and they accepted, gratefully, desperately. After the slaughter at the harbor and the long grief of empty water, the offer of safety was more than any of them could refuse. They ate and rested and healed for an entire year, until one evening a crewman reminded Odysseus, quietly, that their families were still waiting. When Odysseus told Circe he must go, she did not try to hold him. But she spoke one final warning, and it stilled the air between them. "Before you can find your way home," she said, "you must first sail to the very edge of the world, to the boundary where the living end and the dead begin. There is a blind prophet among the shades who alone knows the path. You must hear his voice before you can hear your own shore." Chapter 7. The House of the Dead. They sailed to the place Circe had described, the far western rim of the world, where the ocean poured over the edge of all maps and the sun's light could not follow. The water darkened as they went, changing from blue to slate to something closer to ink, as if the sea itself were slowly losing the will to reflect the sky. The shore they found was not a shore in any proper sense. It was a stretch of gray mud where pale reeds bent in a wind that carried no temperature, neither warm nor cold, only the faint smell of wet earth and something older beneath it. No birds called, no insects hummed. The silence was thick enough to press against the skin. Odysseus did exactly as Circe had instructed. He dug a shallow trench in the soft ground, no wider than a man's forearm, and filled it with offerings, first honey mixed with milk, then sweet wine, then clear water scattered with white barley. Last he drew his sword and cut the throats of 2 black sheep, letting the dark blood pool in the trench and soak slowly into the earth. They came almost immediately, the dead. Not as bodies, but as shapes made of smoke and fading light, drifting forward from the mist in a long, silent procession. Young men with wounds still visible at their throats, old women with hollow eyes, soldiers whose armor hung from them like cloth. They crowded toward the trench with outstretched hands, drawn by the smell of living blood. Odysseus held them back with his drawn sword, keeping them from the trench until the one he sought appeared. The prophet Tiresias, blind in life, blind still in death, moved forward through the gray assembly with the slow certainty of someone who has always seen without needing eyes. He knelt at the trench and drank. When the blood reached him, Tiresias's voice returned, thin but clear, like a sound traveling across a great distance of still water. He spoke directly to Odysseus. "You carry the anger of Poseidon," he said. "The sea god has marked you. Your road will be long and full of loss. But you may still reach home, if you do not make one final mistake." He told Odysseus of an island they would reach, a green island where sacred cattle grazed beneath an unwatched sun. "These belong to Helios, the god who sees everything," Tiresias said. "Do not touch them. Do not let your men touch them. If even one animal is harmed, your ship will be destroyed and every man aboard will die. Only you will survive, and you will arrive home late, alone, and in a stranger's vessel." Odysseus opened his mouth to ask more, but Tiresias was already fading, his outline blurring at the edges like smoke thinning in a draft. He dissolved into the gray air and was gone, leaving only the dark trench and the restless shapes of the dead pressing forward to take his place. Then another figure emerged from the mist, and Odysseus felt his chest constrict, as though a hand had closed around his heart. It was his mother, Anticlea, who had been alive when he sailed for Troy 20 years ago. She had not been among the dead when he left. She had stood in the doorway and waved until his ship was too small to see. She told him, in a voice as quiet as falling cloth, that she had died of grief. Not from illness, not from age, but from the slow, corrosive weight of waiting. Each year without word had taken something from her. First sleep, then appetite, then the desire to walk out into the sunlight. At last, she had simply folded inward, the way a leaf curls when it lets go of the branch. Odysseus reached for her. 3 times he stretched out his arms to hold his mother's shade, and 3 times she passed through him like a breath of cold air. He could not touch her. She could not feel his hands. They stood facing each other across a distance that no embrace could close, the living and the dead separated by something thinner than cloth and harder than stone. Then came Achilles, the greatest warrior Greece had ever produced, the hero whose name alone had once made armies hesitate. In life he had been golden, invulnerable, radiant with a glory that poets would sing about for centuries. Here in the land of the dead, he was a gray figure among gray figures, no brighter than the rest. Odysseus tried to comfort him. Surely, he said, even among the dead, Achilles held the highest place. He was still the most honored name in the world above. No man, living or dead, could match his fame. The words were meant as tribute, the kind of praise warriors offered one another as the highest currency of their world. But Achilles shook his head. "Do not speak to me of glory down here," he said. "I would rather be a living servant, bound to a landless farmer who could barely feed himself, than rule as king over every breathless shade in this place." His words hung in the gray air. The most famous warrior in history, renouncing the very thing that had defined his life. He asked about his son. He asked about his father. Then he, too, turned and walked away into the mist without looking back. Odysseus saw other shades. Ajax, who had died hating him and would not speak, turning his broad back in permanent, silent fury. And Agamemnon, the commander of the Greek armies, who had been murdered in his own bathing chamber on the night of his return home by his wife and her lover. Agamemnon's ghost leaned close. "Trust no one when you reach your shore," he whispered. "Even a faithful wife may not be what she seems. Let no one know you have returned until you are certain of the ground beneath your feet." The warning hung in the damp air between them like the smell of iron. Odysseus had seen enough. The dead pressed closer, their numbers growing, their empty faces multiplying in the fog. He could feel the cold of that place seeping into his limbs, slowing his blood, quieting his thoughts. If he stayed much longer, he feared he might begin to forget which side of the trench he belonged on. He gave the order. His men, pale and shaking, pushed the ship back from that gray shore and pulled at the oars without needing to be told the heading. Any direction was the right one, so long as it led away from there. Behind them, the land of the dead sank back into its permanent twilight, and the color of the sea, slowly, imperceptibly, began to return. Chapter 8. The Singing and the Storm. They returned first to Circe's island, as she had asked them to. She met them at the shore with bread and wine, and the steady calm of someone who had been expecting them. That night, while the crew slept on the beach beside their ship, she sat with Odysseus in her stone hall and told him what lay ahead. 3 trials, each worse than the last. The first was the Sirens. They were creatures who sat on a rocky island in the middle of a narrow strait, surrounded by the bleached bones of sailors and the rotting hulls of ships. Their voices were not merely beautiful. They were something beyond beauty. They sang with a knowledge that reached into the deepest part of each listener and found the thing he longed for most. No man who heard the Sirens' song had ever sailed past them. The music reached into the chest and pulled, gently at first. Then, with an ache so sweet that men threw themselves into the water and swam toward the rocks, forgetting their ships, their crews, their lives. They drowned smiling, or dashed themselves against the stones without understanding what they had done. Circe told Odysseus to seal his crew's ears with softened beeswax, thick enough that no sound could pass through. But she knew him well enough by now to understand that he would want to hear the song for himself. So she gave him a second instruction. He could listen, but only if his men bound him tightly to the mast with heavy rope. And no matter what he said or did, they must not untie him until the island was far behind them. The next morning, as they approached the strait, the wind fell away and the sea went flat and still. Odysseus softened plugs of beeswax in the sun and pressed them into the ears of every man aboard. Then he stood against the mast while his crew wound rope around his chest and arms, binding him so tightly that the fibers pressed grooves into his skin. He nodded. They picked up the oars. The song reached him before he saw the island. It began as a whisper, thin, distant, nearly indistinguishable from the sound of the sea itself. Then it opened, the way a flower opens, into something wider, fuller, a sound that seemed to come from inside his own skull. The Sirens sang of everything he had lost. They sang of Ithaca. They sang of Penelope's voice calling him in from the garden. They sang of his son's first steps. Odysseus strained against the ropes. He screamed at his men to release him. He begged. He wept. He twisted his body until the mast creaked under the force. But the beeswax held. The crew rowed with faces set forward, hearing nothing but the steady splash of their own oars. The island passed slowly, a low hump of pale rock littered with bones, and then fell behind them into the haze. When the song finally faded, Odysseus hung limp against the mast, his wrists raw and bleeding, breathing in long, shuddering gasps. His men removed the wax from their ears and untied him in silence. No one asked what he had heard. The look on his face was enough. But there was no time to recover. Ahead, the channel narrowed between two towering cliffs. On the left, at the base of one cliff, the sea swirled inward in a massive churning vortex, a mouth of spinning water that swallowed everything within reach and pulled it down into blackness. This was Charybdis, and 3 times each day she drank the sea and spat it back. On the right, high up on the opposite cliff, something moved among the rocks. 6 long, serpentine necks ending in 6 heads, each lined with rows of teeth. This was Scylla, a creature who had once been something else and was now only hunger. She lived in a cave halfway up the cliff face and struck at every ship that passed, each head seizing one man from the deck. There was no safe passage between them. Sailing too far left meant the whole ship vanishing into the whirlpool. Sailing too far right brought every man within reach of Scylla's mouths. Odysseus had to choose, and Circe had already told him what the choice must be. Lose 6 men to Scylla, or lose everyone to Charybdis. There was no third option. He did not tell his crew. He could not find the words to say that 6 of them were already marked for death by his own decision. He ordered them to hug the right-hand cliff and row with everything they had. They bent to the oars, pulling hard through the spray and the noise of the whirlpool. Odysseus stood at the bow with a spear in each hand, staring upward at the rocks, though he knew a spear was useless against what lived there. Scylla struck without warning. 6 necks shot downward from the cliff in a single blur of motion. 6 men were lifted screaming from the deck, plucked from their benches like fish from a pool. Their oars clattered to the planking. Their voices carried briefly over the roar of the water, calling out to Odysseus by name, reaching for him with outstretched hands. Then the heads withdrew into the cave, and there was nothing. The ship cleared the strait. The whirlpool fell behind. The remaining men rowed in stunned, mechanical silence, their eyes fixed on the 6 empty rowing benches and the oars that lay where they had fallen. Odysseus stood at the stern and looked back at the cliff, gripping the rail until his knuckles whitened. He said later that of everything he had endured, every monster, every storm, every God-sent trial, this was the moment that hurt the most. They needed rest. When a green island appeared on the horizon, the crew begged to go ashore. Odysseus recognized it from Tiresias's warning. The island where the cattle of the sun god Helios grazed in the open fields, sacred and untouchable. He wanted to sail past without stopping. But his men were broken. They had nothing left. He relented, but made every man swear an oath not to harm the animals. For a month, they waited on that island as contrary winds trapped them at the shore. Their provisions ran out. They ate fish and wild birds, growing thinner and more desperate each day. The golden cattle grazed just beyond their camp. Sleek, beautiful, seemingly endless. Odysseus walked the far side of the island each morning, keeping himself away from the temptation. One afternoon, while he slept in the shade of a grove, his crew broke their oath. A man named Eurylochus, the same man who had once fled Circe's house, stood before the others and spoke plainly. Of all the ways to die, starvation was the worst. If they must face the anger of a god, let them face it with full stomachs. The men slaughtered the finest cattle and roasted the meat over driftwood fires. Odysseus woke to the smell of cooking flesh and knew immediately what had happened. He ran to the beach and found them sprawled in the sand, sated and unrepentant. There was nothing left to do. The meat was eaten. The oath was broken. When they launched the ship the following morning, the sky was already changing. Clouds gathering from the west with an unnatural speed, the light draining out of the air as if someone were drawing a curtain across the sun. Zeus answered, first. A single bolt of white lightning split the sky and struck the ship dead center. The mast shattered. The hull broke apart. Men fell into churning water, their screams swallowed instantly by the roar of the storm. Within minutes, every man was dead, pulled down by the weight of the sea, or crushed by the tumbling wreckage, or simply taken by the cold. Only Odysseus survived. He clung to the broken mast and the splintered keel, lashing them together with a strip of rope as the storm dragged him across miles of open water. For days he drifted, drinking rain when it fell, watching the horizon for any dark shape that might be land. The sea was empty. The sky was empty. He was the last man left of all who had sailed from Troy, alone on an ocean that had swallowed everything he had ever commanded. Chapter 9. 7 years on the hidden shore. The currents carried him for days, or perhaps it was longer. Time lost its shape on the open water. Odysseus drifted on his makeshift raft of broken timber, half-conscious, his lips cracked with salt, his hands raw from gripping the splintered wood. When sleep came, it was not rest but a kind of flickering darkness in which the faces of drowned men rose and fell like waves. He washed ashore on a beach of fine white sand, beneath cliffs covered in trailing vines. The air smelled of cedar and wild cypress. Freshwater streams threaded down through the rocks and pooled in shallow basins near the shore. Birds sang in the canopy above, not the harsh cries of seabirds, but the slow, liquid notes of songbirds sheltered deep within old trees. This was Ogygia, a hidden island at the far edge of the world, so remote that neither gods nor mortals visited without extraordinary cause. Its only inhabitant was a nymph named Calypso, daughter of the Titan Atlas, who had once held the sky upon his shoulders. She lived alone in a vaulted cave, hung with grapevines, its entrance framed by a garden of wild violet, parsley, and soft meadow grass. Calypso found Odysseus, lying half dead in the surf, and carried him into her cave. She laid him on a bed of woven rushes, fed him ambrosia and nectar, and nursed him back to strength over many slow days. She was beautiful in the way that immortal things are beautiful, unchanging, luminous, slightly distant from the textures of the ordinary world. She fell in love with him, and she made him an offer that no mortal had ever received, to stay with her forever, not as a guest, but as her husband, sharing in her immortality. He would never age. He would never die. He would live on this quiet island, surrounded by beauty and abundance, for all of eternity. She asked only that he stop trying to leave. Odysseus refused. Not quickly, not rudely, but with a certainty that did not waver no matter how many times she asked. He told her that Penelope was not as beautiful as a goddess. He knew that. He told her that Ithaca was a rocky, windswept island with thin soil and difficult winters. He knew that too, but it was his. They were his. And he would rather grow old on that stony ground than live forever in paradise without them. For 7 years, he sat on the rocks above the western shore each evening and watched the sun sink into the sea. Behind him, the cave glowed with warm firelight. Calypso sang at her golden loom, a sound so lovely it made the air feel heavier. But Odysseus looked only at the horizon, searching for a coastline that never appeared, his cheeks wet with salt that may have been sea spray, or may not have been. Far above, on the high peak of Mount Olympus, the goddess Athena finally spoke. She stood before Zeus in the council of the gods and asked how long one man must suffer, for a single act of pride shouted across the water years ago. Odysseus had honored the gods at every altar. He had burned sacrifices faithfully throughout the war. Was Poseidon's grudge to last forever? Zeus listened. He did not overrule his brother's anger. That was not the way of gods. But he decided that enough time had passed. He sent Hermes, the messenger god, down through the bright air to Calypso's island with a single command: let Odysseus go. The man's fate was to return home. No nymph, however powerful, could hold what the fates had already released. Calypso received Hermes on the beach and heard his message in silence. Then she spoke, not in obedience, but in bitterness. You gods are cruel to goddesses, she said. When a god takes a mortal lover, no one objects. But when a goddess does the same, you send your messengers to tear him away. Still, she would not defy Zeus. She walked back to the cave where Odysseus sat staring at the sea, and told him he was free. She helped him build a raft, a simple craft of bound logs, fitted with a mast and a square sail of woven cloth. She stocked it with bread, dark wine, and skins of fresh water. On the morning he launched it, she stood at the water's edge and watched him go without calling out. The wind caught the sail. The raft moved slowly away from the hidden shore. Behind him, the island grew smaller and smaller, and the sound of her singing faded into the sound of the open sea. For 17 days, Odysseus sailed alone under clear skies, steering by the stars as Calypso had taught him. Then Poseidon, returning from a feast among distant gods, looked down from the clouds and saw the tiny raft crossing his domain. His rage returned in full. He raised his hand, and the sea convulsed. The storm struck with a force that bent the mast double and tore the sail to ribbons. Waves broke over the raft and pulled it apart log by log. Odysseus was thrown into the water, dragged down by the weight of his soaked clothing, tumbled through the dark. At the moment he was certain he would drown, a sea goddess named Ino rose from the depths and pressed a shimmering veil into his hands. "Wrap this around your chest," she said. "It will not let you sink." He swam for 2 days and 2 nights, the veil keeping him afloat through swells that rose as high as hills. On the 3rd morning, he saw land, a green shore backed by wooded mountains. He dragged himself through the surf and collapsed beneath a thicket of wild olive trees, pulling a blanket of fallen leaves over his body. He slept without dreaming for the first time in years. He was woken by laughter. A group of young women were washing linen in the river nearby, tossing a ball between them in the shallows. Among them was a girl taller than the rest, with the composure of someone raised in a palace. This was Nausicaa, princess of the Phaeacians, a seafaring people who lived on this island called Sharia, far from the world of gods and monsters. Odysseus approached her carefully, filthy, naked, caked in salt, barely recognizable as a man, let alone a king. But his words were gentle and precise, chosen with the instinct of someone who understood that language, rightly used, could open any door. Nausicaa listened. She gave him clothing, food, and directions to her father's palace. She told him to ask for her mother's mercy first, for in that house, the queen's word carried further than the king's. The palace of Alcinous was built of bronze and gold, its gardens watered by eternal springs. The king received the ragged stranger without asking his name, for the customs of that place demanded that a guest be fed and rested before questions were asked. That night, at a feast of roasted meat and honeyed wine, a blind poet sang of the fall of Troy. Odysseus turned his face away and wept into his cloak. Alcinous noticed the tears and gently asked the stranger who he was and why the song of Troy brought him such grief. Odysseus lowered the cloak from his face. He said his name, and then, slowly, with the firelight playing across his weathered face, he began to tell the story of his wanderings, from Troy to the Cyclones, from the Lotus Eaters to the Cyclops' cave, through wind and sorcery and the land of the dead, past the Sirens and between the jaws of monsters, all the way to the hidden shore where a goddess had held him for 7 lonely years. The hall fell silent. No one moved, and the story he told that night is the one we have been following together, step by step, across the dark water. Chapter 10. The Beggar King. When Odysseus finished his tale, King Alcinous rose from his seat and made a promise. The Phaeacians were the finest sailors in the world. Their ships moved without rudders, guided by thought alone, faster than any vessel on the open sea. He would give Odysseus the swiftest ship in his fleet, crewed by his best men, and they would carry him home to Ithaca before the next dawn. The ship sailed that night. Odysseus lay down on the deck among gifts of bronze and gold and woven cloth, and for the first time in 20 years, the sea did not threaten him. The ship moved through the darkness in absolute silence, cutting the water without spray, as though it were gliding across the surface of a dream. He was asleep when they reached Ithaca. The Phaeacian sailors carried him ashore without waking him, and laid him gently on the sand of a sheltered cove, placing the gifts around him in neat piles. Then they rowed away into the retreating night. When Odysseus opened his eyes, he was alone on a familiar beach, beneath a sky full of fading stars. He did not recognize it at first. 20 years had softened the shapes of things in his memory, and a morning mist hung low over the harbor, blurring the outlines of the hills. Then Athena appeared beside him, not in disguise this time, but as herself, gray-eyed and calm, carrying the faint scent of olive groves. "Welcome home," she said, "but your work is not finished." She told him what waited at the palace. The 108 suitors, the exhausted queen, the son he had never known. If Odysseus walked through his own front door as himself, the suitors would kill him before he reached the hearth. He needed a plan, and he needed time. So Athena touched his skin, and his appearance changed. His hair turned white, his back bent. His strong arms thinned to sinew and old bone. He became, to any watching eye, a wandering beggar too poor to threaten anyone. In this disguise, Odysseus walked the familiar paths of his own island, as if seeing it for the first time. The olive trees were taller. The stone walls had shifted. He passed farms he had once known by name and was recognized by no one. His feet carried him not to the palace, but to a rough hut on the hillside, where a man named Eumaeus, his loyal swineherd, lived among his animals, still faithfully tending his absent master's pigs after 20 years. Eumaeus did not recognize the beggar, but he welcomed him without hesitation. He offered him bread, a seat by the fire, and a blanket for the night. He spoke of his old master with such tenderness that Odysseus had to look away to keep his expression steady. The swineherd did not know he was sitting across the fire from the very man whose memory he was honoring. It was here, in this rough hut smelling of wood smoke and animals, that Odysseus met his son. Telemachus arrived the next morning, guided by Athena, and when the two of them were alone, Odysseus revealed himself. Athena lifted the disguise. The old beggar straightened. His shoulders broadened. His eyes cleared. Telemachus stared at the stranger becoming his father and could not speak. When words finally came, they came as tears, and the two men held each other in a silence that filled the room more completely than any language could. Together they made a plan. Odysseus would return to the palace in his beggar's rags. Telemachus would go ahead and say nothing. They would watch and wait and count their enemies. And when the moment came, they would act together. Father and son, side by side, for the first time in their lives. Odysseus entered his own palace through the back gate, stooped and filthy, leaning on a stick. The suitors barely glanced at him. Some threw scraps. One kicked a footstool at his shins. He absorbed it all without a flicker, moving through the hall with the patient invisibility of a man who has learned to swallow every kind of pride. In the courtyard, lying on a pile of dung beside the gate, an old dog lifted his head. His name was Argos. He had been a young hunting hound when Odysseus left for Troy. Swift, keen-nosed, the pride of the household. Now he was ancient, flea-bitten, too weak to stand. No one had cared for him in years. But when the disguised beggar passed through the gate, Argos raised his ears. His tail moved once against the ground. He knew. Odysseus saw the dog and recognized him. He could not stop. He could not kneel or call the old hound's name without betraying everything. He turned his face away and wiped his eyes with the back of his hand as he walked past. Behind him, Argos laid his gray head down on the dung heap, closed his eyes, and was still. He had waited 20 years for this single moment, and it was enough. That evening, the old nurse Eurycleia knelt to wash the beggar's feet, a customary act of hospitality in that house. As she lifted his leg, her fingers brushed a long, ridged scar above his knee, a mark left by a wild boar's tusk during a hunt in his youth. She had bandaged that wound herself, decades ago. Her hands froze. She looked up at his face. Her mouth opened. Odysseus caught her wrist and held it. "Not a word," he whispered. She nodded, trembling, the basin of water sloshing against her knees. She finished washing his feet in silence, her hands shaking, tears rolling down her lined face. She said nothing to anyone, but she knew. The next morning, Penelope descended into the great hall and made an announcement. She would hold a final contest. Whoever could string the great bow of Odysseus, a weapon so powerful that no ordinary man could bend it, and shoot a single arrow cleanly through the iron rings of 12 axe heads set in a row, would win her hand and the throne of Ithaca. The suitors murmured with excitement. None of them doubted they would succeed. One by one, they tried. The first could not even bend the bow enough to hook the string. The second strained until his hands bled. A third warmed the wood with oil and tried again. A fourth gave up without a word. Down the line they went. Strong, proud, well-fed men, and not one of them could draw the great bow even halfway to its curve. The weapon resisted them as though it were alive. Then the beggar stepped forward and asked, quietly, if he might try. The hall erupted in jeering, but Telemachus, standing near the door, his hand resting lightly on the hilt of a hidden sword, spoke with an authority that silenced the room. "Let him try. It is my father's bow, and this is still my father's house." Odysseus took the bow. He turned it slowly in his hands, examining it the way a musician examines an instrument he has not played in many years, testing the curve, feeling the grain, remembering the precise tension of the string. Then, without visible effort, he bent the great bow and hooked the string into its notch. The sound it made, a deep, clean hum, filled the hall like the note of a struck bell. He knocked an arrow, drew the string to his cheek, and released. The arrow sang through the air and passed cleanly through all 12 axe rings, one after another, embedding itself in the far wall with a thud that echoed into perfect silence. No one breathed, no one moved. Every man in that room understood, in the same terrible instant, what was about to happen. Odysseus straightened to his full height. The rags fell away from his bearing like a shed skin. He turned the bow toward the nearest suitor. At the doorway, Telemachus drew his sword and locked the bolt. What followed was swift and without mercy, the reckoning of 20 years compressed into a single blood-dimmed hour. Father and son fought side by side in the hall where the boy had grown up fatherless. When it was finished, the great room was quiet again for the first time in years. But the story does not end in that hall. It ends upstairs in a quieter room, where Penelope, cautious, brilliant, faithful Penelope, tested the man who claimed to be her husband one final time. She told a servant, loudly enough for him to hear, to move the great bed out of the bedchamber, so the guest could sleep comfortably. Odysseus turned sharply. "Move the bed?" "That bed cannot be moved," he said, his voice rising for the first time. "I built it myself, around the trunk of a living olive tree that grows through the floor of this house. Its roots go down into the earth beneath the foundation. No man alive could move it unless he cut the tree itself." Penelope looked at him. Only 2 people in the world knew the secret of that bed: the man who had built it and the woman who had slept in it for 20 years before he left. She crossed the room. She put her arms around him, and the distance that had stretched between them for 2 decades, across oceans and islands, past monsters and gods, through silence and grief and the slow erosion of hope, closed at last in the space of a single breath. Outside, the night settled over Ithaca. The palace grew still. Somewhere below the hill, the sea moved against the shore in its old, patient rhythm. The same sound it had made when Odysseus sailed away. The same sound it had made every night since. The same sound it makes now, if you listen closely enough, wherever you are. That is where the story ends. Not with triumph, not with a shout, but with a bed that cannot be moved, and 2 people who found each other again after the longest journey in the ancient world. Thank you for staying with me through this one. If this story carried you somewhere quiet tonight, you might consider subscribing, so the next tale will be waiting whenever you need it. Rest well, the sea is calm, the lamps are low, and the road home, however long it was, has reached its end at last.